So we have a very special guest kicking off this manager meeting, or this series of manager-director meetings. This is Gwen Ryan, and today she is going to talk to you about dealing with difficult situations, people, and she has a really good presentation. So we're glad you're here, and we'll let her say hi.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys this morning. And usually when I have a topic, I say I'm just so excited to speak about one of my favorite topics, but talking about difficult people is actually not one of my favorites. But however, it is a necessity that we look at how we deal with people that make our lives miserable. I talked a little bit, or I titled this session this morning, This Job Doesn't Pay Enough. Because when we have people who are wonderful and who are great, you know, sometimes we think, oh, you know, I'd probably do this job for free. But all it takes is one really difficult person to make you stop and think about whether or not you really earn enough money to put up with the things that you have to put up with on your job. So this morning, we're going to just talk briefly. We have about 2 hours to talk about who those difficult people are, how they impact the work environment, and some things that we might do differently if we're in a supervisory position to change that, so that we create the kind of work environment that sustains, keeps people there long term, and that causes people to feel really good about coming to work. And we know that when people feel good about what they do a better job. So the end result or the outcome is a better product. And you guys all know what your product is and who the customer is for that product. It's all the people that you serve on your respective campuses. So I'd like to hear from you guys in terms of who's here this morning and what you would like to leave with in terms of any questions that you might have about either working with difficult employees, being a difficult employee, management type questions in terms of what's legal when you're working with difficult people and so on. So if we just take a couple of minutes, and if you would send those questions that you might have to Jeff, and then we'll be ready to get started with This Job Doesn't Pay Enough, working with difficult people.
Okay, y'all, you can just put them in the chat box. If anybody has the ability to unmute and mute back, you could do that and speak into your computer and ask a question that way as well. But we do ask when we start presenting again that you make sure your computers are muted so that we don't have feedback.
Anybody unmuted? Want to share with the group who you are? What you hope to walk away with today?
Hi, I'm April, and I'm with Priority Charter Schools, and I'm hoping that I learn how to help my employees with conflict.
Okay. Anybody else? If we have any information, no questions, no introductions in the chat room. Okay, well, I'm going to go away and we're going to get started with the presentation.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Do you guys see the PowerPoint presentation?
See it? Okay, they see it.
Okay.
All right.
All right. This job doesn't pay enough. Well, maybe it does for you guys. But for a lot of people who end up in situations where it's uncomfortable and you spend an inordinate amount of time dealing with employee conflicts, dealing with employees who have issues that impact the entire workforce or your entire work environment, sometimes the money just seemed to be enough. So we have a couple of agenda items for today, and they are, we're going to identify some of the difficult behaviors. People aren't difficult. There are people who have difficult behaviors. So we're going to look at some of those difficult behaviors that get in the way of us having that ideal work environment that we'd like to have for all employees. We're going to explore some reasons that employees come to us with some of those difficult behaviors. No behaviors exist in isolation. There is always a reason for every behavior that we engage in, good or bad, and that our employees bring into the work environment, good or bad. We're also going to discuss some strategies for addressing some of those difficult behaviors. And we're going to engage in a problem-solving scenario, a problem-solving activity at the end of the session this morning. And unless you guys have one that you'd like to discuss and put out to the whole group, I'll just make up one. And I'll keep it pretty simple. But you guys may have something a lot more interesting, so be thinking about that. And then hopefully along the way, I hope that we'll have some fun, because if what you do is not fun, there's not much point in doing it. It's time to move on and look for something different to do. So be sure to send any questions that you might have, any comments that you might have to Jeff, who's managing our chat room this morning. So let's just jump in and get started. The reality is, if you're in a supervisory position, and it doesn't matter where or how many people you supervise, unless it's just you and you're supervising yourself, but we're going to deal with people. And anytime we deal with other people, there is an increased opportunity that some of those people may come in and they're not aligned with the same expectations that we have behaviorally or socially in the work environment. And that's just a part of being in that position, that we deal with people who sometimes exhibit difficult behaviors that get in the way of us being successful with what we do and others being successful with what they do in the work environment. So realizing that that's going to happen, the best strategy is to be prepared. So to look at prevention. Maybe you have wonderful employees. You've never had to deal with anyone who came to you with any type of difficult behaviors. They were ideal. You hope to keep them until they turn 87 years old before they decide that they're going to retire. And if you do, we want you to be presenting this and sharing with us what the secret is to maintaining that type of work environment. Because for most of us who have been in supervisory positions or in supervisory positions, somewhere along the way, we get that one person that makes it difficult for us to get up and be excited about going to work every day. So we're going to talk primarily this morning about prevention, and then we'll talk some about intervention based on any questions that you might have or any information that you'd like to share. So there will be an opportunity, because we'll do a couple of activities this morning for you to either send in your response via chat, or if you can unmute, to share those in an unmuted way when you unmute. So let's talk about some of the personalities or the different types of difficult people that we deal with. As I was going through this list, I'm now retired, and the only difficult person that I deal with now is my spouse, because he has an expectation that all the things he used to help with in the house, because I'm retired, they're all my responsibility. So that makes it difficult sometimes, but we're getting better with that. But I was going through this list. I thought about the very first job that I had. I graduated at 10 o'clock in the morning, had an interview at 2 o'clock and walked out of that interview at 4 o'clock with a job. Supervising, not just me doing the job, but in a supervisory position. And I had never been in a supervisory position other than supervising my 8 siblings, because I was the oldest of 9. So I bossed them around. That's the same as supervising, by the way. So that's the only supervisory experience that I had. And what I believed was that people would come in with the same expectations in that work environment that I had, that we're all going to be one big family, and we're all going to get along, and we're going to love the work that we did. And it was, unfortunately, for some of them, it was working with children, that they would all love children, because I love children, because I was still a kid who hadn't really grown up myself, and was really dismayed when I found out that I was going to be supervising some of these characters. So let's just take a look at some of them. And as we go through the list, think about which of these really get your goat. And if there are any young people in the group who don't know what getting your goat means, it means that there are folk that engage in behaviors that are so unnerving to you that you could hit them in the head with a shoe. That's my definition of getting your goat. But over the years, what I learned is that people can't get your goat if they don't know where you have your goat tied. So if we tie our goats up somewhere and they don't know about it, they can't get our goat. So that means that we need to be aware of the behaviors that impact us most of all. And there are a couple of things on the list that bother me more than others. So complainers, believe it or not, are at the top of my list. So that's why I put it first. But people who complain about everything, nothing in the work environment is ever right, nor do they have any solutions on ways to improve it, to make it better. Another one is people who are just hostile. They come in and they challenge your authority, they challenge other people, they just have that hostile attitude. Then we have people who are whiners. They whine about it's too hot in here, and I do more work than anybody else, and I don't get paid any more money for it, and I get in trouble when I take a break that's like 25 seconds longer than anybody else's. And then you get the people who are underminers. They're second on my list. They smile at you. They look to do a decent job, but as soon as your back is turned, they're backstabbers. That's what underminers are. They undermine your authority. They go against things that you've said once they're away from you. And then you have people that are just outright lazy. Now, they're pretty easy to deal with, because the bottom line is you're going to do your job and you're going to get up out of here. You're not going to be here. So lazy people are a little easier to deal with, but we get those lazy people. And then you get the people who know it all. They know your job better than you do. They know everybody else's job better than they do. And sometimes they don't mind telling you that they know how to do it a different way. And when they worked on so-and-so campus, this is how they did it. And it worked a lot better than the way that you expect them to do it, because they got all the answers. They know it all. Then you get some of those folk that just have a negative attitude. And the thing about it is we can't change attitudes. We can encourage and work with people to change their behavior. And sometimes as behaviors change, attitudes will change with those behaviors. So a lot of times we think if they have such a negative attitude, they just change that attitude. Well, there are some behavioral things that have to change before attitudes will change. And then we get bullies. Bullies are number 3 on my list. I have just a really difficult time dealing with people who bully others. You know, they tell other people how to do their job. They threaten others about their job. They make the workplace feel really intimidating because of those behaviors that they engage in. And then you have people who are insubordinate. I don't care how many times you tell them to do it, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do what you ask them to do because you're really not their boss in their mind. So as you think about these individuals, I'd like for you to think about others that you might add to this list in terms of people that you've worked with or people that you're currently working with this year. And send those to the chat or just unmute and share those with us. So let's take a minute and hopefully we'll get people awake here. I'm the person who's still sleepy. You guys are used to being up this time of morning. I usually get up at 9 and I have to watch Matlock from 9 to 10 before I really get moving. So come on, guys, and share that information with us this morning. Jeff is getting bored.
Someone said emotional people.
Oh, emotional people. People who come in and they're just either overly excited or they're, depressed, and all of that is manifested through some type of action in the work environment. People who cry bother me. I don't know why, but the criers bother me. I feel bad because we should only cry when we're really, really happy or really, really sad. So those emotional people who cry because the bread got a little brown around the edges would really bother me.
Dramatic.
Yeah, dramatic people, overly dramatic people. Okay, that's another great one. Any others?
I have an employee who likes to hide stuff when she's frustrated.
What does she hide? Does she hide physical things?
Yes, she does.
Okay, like the big baking pan and nobody can find it and it was served there yesterday when you left the building?
Heaters for a mixer and different things like that, just small stuff, keys.
Okay, I would put that in the category of passive aggressive behavior. Because those are things that you have to be able to do your job, and you're dependent on them. They make the decision whether or not they disclose to you where those things are, or you have to invest emotional energy trying to find those things that you need. So it's passive aggressive behavior.
I had another one here, reluctant to change.
Oh, reluctant to change. That's really difficult. And we'll talk about options for dealing with people who are reluctant to change. Because the reality is we can't make anybody do anything they choose not to do. For many years in my previous life, I worked with classroom teachers in classroom management. And of course, teachers have difficult students just as you have difficult employees. And the most difficult thing for teachers or for parents, as far as that goes, to acknowledge is that you truly can't make children do anything they choose not to do. Now, my mother used to disagree with me. My mother came to a parenting workshop that I did one time, and she said, "That was really, really good, Gwendolyn." She's the only person that called me Gwendolyn. "That was really good, but I disagree with one thing. When you said a parent can't make their kids do anything they don't want to do, I disagree with that, because I made y'all. Y'all did what you needed to do and what I expected of you." And I said, "We did, but you didn't make us do it. You created conditions that were so uncomfortable that we chose to do those things." And so that's what we can do with those employees who refuse to change. We can create conditions under which they might be more willing to change. And certainly not necessarily negative conditions, because we can create positive conditions that cause people to want to change their behavior. You can give them a big, fat, juicy raise with the expectation that those behaviors change. And a lot of times the odds of them changing are much greater than if you use sometimes really negative ones. Now, I know in food service, y'all have lots of money, so that probably is not unreasonable to give some of the people who want change a big, fat 25% raise during the year. Any others?
I had one more with a whiner, but it was not good.
Oh, a whiner. Yeah, those are at the top of my list. Complainers and whiners. I can deal with almost anything but complainers and whiners. So the next thing that I'd like for you to do, if you're a part of a group or if you're by yourself, to just kind of jot down some things on how do those difficult employees affect others in the workplace. Bottom line is how do they impact your work environment? And we're going to take 3 minutes to do that. So you can run and get a cup of coffee, run to the restroom, but jot down and be ready to share those things at the end of our 3 minutes. Can we mute us?
That's what I was looking for.
Please go up at the top. Go up to there. Mute. There you go.
Guys, you have about 15 seconds to wrap up that one question, and then we'll discuss it. Okay, let's talk about how these difficult behaviors affect the work environment. So if you can unmute, just unmute and share with us. And then if you can't unmute, we'll look at what you sent in on chat. So anybody?
I'll start off with one of the ones on chat.
Okay.
So Craig at Mahia said negativity affects morale, decreases productivity, causes conflict, and a decline in customer service and food quality. So it's negativity that affects morale, productivity, increases conflict, and decrease in customer service.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Craig. You hit the nail on the head with the shoe. That's what I hammer in stuff with. I have a hammer of my own, but you're exactly right. Anybody else? I hope you don't have those people, Craig, but thank you for sharing those great ideas. Anybody else?
These behaviors seem to just tear down everybody else in the kitchen, and sometimes, like Craig said, with our customer service.
Okay, and tell us who you are.
April.
April.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for sharing, April.
So Calvin says having a positive attitude can help turn negative attitudes around. So kill them with kindness, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. Killing them with kindness. Depending on why that behavior is occurring. Thank you for sharing, Calvin. Anybody else? One more and we'll move on. One brave person jump in there. You know, silence usually creates discomfort and usually someone will jump in, but you guys are good at this. Nobody jumped in. So let's talk about why people come to us with some of those behaviors. An important thing to keep in mind, especially if you have a really, really difficult employee, is that behaviors don't exist in isolation. There's a function for all behaviors, and all behaviors we can put in one or the other of two categories. One reason that we engage in behaviors, both positive and negative, is because we have a need for something. So for example, sometimes individuals who are passive, aggressive, engage in that behavior for power and control. They don't feel empowered, so they look for ways to gain power. Employees who engage in insubordination, who just outright say, I'm not doing it, do what you need to do, but I'm not doing it. Insubordination. That's about power and control. So one of the reasons that we engage in behavior is to get something, and oftentimes they're tied to basic human needs. So we'll have a lot of time to talk about what those basic human needs are, but we engage in behavior to get our needs met, whatever those needs are. And when you deal with different employees, they all come to you with different needs. The other reason that behavior exists is to escape or to avoid. So two categories, we can put any behavior depending on why they're using that behavior in one or the other of those categories. So lazy employees who hide out, spend time in an inordinate amount of time in the restroom because they just don't want to do the work, that's escape-related behavior. They engage in that to escape during the work that we have laid out for them. So when we start thinking about those people and behavior, if we can take away the name and that personal face of that employee and ask the question, why are they like this? Why are they engaging in this kind of behavior? Whiners and complainers usually are looking for attention or for some way to be validated. So, you know, when you get the complainer and they complain to you and you say, well, you know, it could be worse. You could be working for so-and-so on so-and-so's campus over there, and they got 900 first graders on that campus who come through the line every day. It could be, you know, when you validate that, it doesn't get any better for the person who's the complainer, because what it actually does is it serves to meet the need that they have, and that is to be validated through that negative behavior. And so there are things that we want to do differently with employees who complain and who whine versus an employee who engages in escape-related behavior or passive-aggressive behavior. Now, I have to admit that I have been a difficult employee. And my favorite behavior was passive-aggressive behavior. I'm not proud of that, but it's just the way that it was. I had a boss or a supervisor who was very, very controlling. And it was basically her way, or she would oftentimes say the highway. But in the 6 years that I worked there, nobody was ever terminated. And there are people who had behaviors that were lots worse than passive aggressive. Not that passive aggressive behavior is not a bad behavior to bring into a work environment. But because of her need to be in total control of everything, my response to that was often passive aggressive, to say, okay, I'll do it that way. And then I would do it my way, which is passive aggressive behavior, because my way is much better than the way you want us to do it, or you want me to do it. So from time to time, we have probably all engaged in poor behavior in the work environment. But it's those employees who consistently engage in that behavior that can cause the work environment to be a place that feels really negative and that causes others to be uncomfortable or to not enjoy the space that they're in. And so when that's the case, we certainly want to address that. Now, are there times when people show up with difficult behavior because of circumstances that just happen to be occurring in their lives? Absolutely. If you ran over the dog backing out of the driveway and your child had a major meltdown because you killed the dog and you didn't stop and have a dog funeral before you dropped them off at school, and they refused to get out of the car, and you have to literally drag your kid out the car and you swap them on the hiney, and the principal says, if you hit him again like that, I'm going to have to call the police and CPS because we don't hit kids on this campus. And so you're upset about that, and you get to work and somebody comes to you and says, we had 3 employees to call in this morning. They say they all have the flu and they can't come in. You're not in a good position to be the best supervisor for that day. So sometimes we have circumstances that occur to cause us to engage in difficult behavior because we're human. And once you ran over the dog and your kid had a meltdown and you swatted them and the administrator threatened you, you may just show up and engage in behavior where others think, wow, she's being difficult today, or he's being difficult today. Wonder what happened to him. He got up on the wrong side of the bed or whatever. But that's situational. We can always come back and say, guys, I apologize. Let me tell you what the situation was. And then we explain that and people understand it. It's those people who engage in ongoing behavior in the work environment that we want to talk about. So those are the people that we're going to be talking about from this point on. There was a study when I was thinking about putting this session together this morning and looking at what we could realistically do in the short amount of time that we had, and I found this study. And at the very top of the list, we can see that when you think about difficult people in the work environment, that over 55% of people that responded to this survey that was done back in 2016 said that their morale was affected, that their morale suffered because they worked in an environment with people who engaged in difficult behavior. That's over the half of the people. So if you had 6 employees, that's 3 of your people who come to you with poor morale. Their morale has suffered. And then you can see the results of that as it goes down the list. None of them are good. Even the last one, where 23% of people said that they called in sick. Just didn't want to come in and have to be around that person, that it affected them to the point that they were willing to use their sick leave, or if they're working in an environment where they don't have sick leave, they were willing to have their pay docked. My husband works in an environment, he works in a call center. And it's not the kind of call center where people call you to sell you something or to tell you about wonderful products out there. They provide a service, and when you don't take care of that service, you lose that service. So people typically call in and they're really, really unhappy. And they have some long-term employees. Like, how do people put up with that every day? People calling in and they curse them out, they hang up on them, they call supervisors and complain about them, they make up stories about them, and they have long-term employees, people that have been there for 25 years, 18 years, and so on. So as I was thinking about that, because I was like, I couldn't do it. If people calling, cussing me out every day, I ain't gonna do that job. I'll go to work at McDonald's or Burger King, somewhere where they're making that new veggie burger. No way I put up with that every day, but people do. And so as I think about the things that they do, they deal with some of the employees that have difficult behaviors, so they certainly have progressive discipline. But the other thing on the other side is they do so many wonderful things. They provide food for each department. Excuse me. They provide food for one department. So my husband is an administrator and he takes his lunch to work because he's diabetic and that's the healthy way to do it. But usually he brings it home because somebody's department today had steaks and baked potatoes and they invited him over to eat, or somebody cooked hot dogs, or somebody had fajitas in their department. They give employees balloons, they have cookies, they use catering services for the entire facility, and they have about 150 employees, and they use top of the line caterers. They don't use the local pizza place to bring in pizza already cut up. They use people who cater full meals for their employees. And so despite the fact that it's a difficult work environment in terms of the work that they have to do, they work really hard to do things to keep the morale of their employees up. So despite the fact that you got cursed out 6 times a day and somebody talked about your mama and what they would do to your mama if they knew who your mama was, these people keep coming back to that job. And so the reason for that is because they work really hard. They recognize that the work is difficult, so they work really hard so that they can decrease the number of people who respond in the work environment in ways that are listed on this list here. So I'd like for you to just kind of think about the people that you work with. And if you were to do this survey, even if you only have 4 employees, if you were to do this survey, what would come out at the top of the list? You know, a little over a third felt anger towards their coworkers or their employer who engaged in that difficult behavior. If you come to work angry or you feel really angry, we know that anger can cause some physical things to happen. So that also increases the likelihood that you're going to have employees who get physically sick as a result of being in that work environment. So it's critical that we look at some of these employees and their behaviors really early on. Like if you have an employee who's exhibiting some of these behaviors and have been for the past couple of weeks, then it's time to address it. We don't want to let those behaviors just linger on and on because of the impact that they can have on others in the work environment. So looking at productive ways to do that is certainly where we'd like to start. So it's uncomfortable to have to deal with employees. We just want people to come to work and do their job. That's what we want them to do. Just come in and do your job. But the reality is that we can't let behaviors go that impact us in supervisory positions, or you in a supervisory position, or the employees, other employees that work in your various departments. You can't let the behavior go because of the outcome and the bottom line. And I think it was Craig that says the bottom line is decreased productivity for the customers that you serve. It's hard to come in and do everything that you need to do when you feel bullied, or when you feel uncomfortable around other people, or when employers, because sometimes the difficult person in that situation is actually the employer. It may not necessarily be an employee. So, you know, thinking about ourselves and our willingness to change how we engage with people is important as well. So we have to deal with the behaviors. Can't let them go. We have to deal with them. So I'd like for you to take just a minute and think about a difficult situation that you've been in with an employee, or, you know, even if as an employer, you've been in a difficult situation where there was someone on that list of people that we looked at, those whiners and complainers, and, you know, the insubordinates, where you made decisions that you were uncomfortable with later, or that you perhaps even regretted later. So take a minute and think about that, and share any thoughts that you might have with that, either via chat or unmute and share that with us. So let's take 1 minute to think about it and then share. Okay, guys, 1 minute went by really, really quickly. So would anybody like to share any thoughts that you have about that difficult employee, or whether or not you were difficult? I admit I was at one point in time. Never as a supervisor, though.
I found that when you, this is April from Priority, I found when you kind of see what's going on with that person, like you get down to the heart of it, sometimes that seems to help. You're not just looking at them as an employee, but you're looking at them as a person.
Absolutely. Thank you, April. We have a couple of people in the room I know who have been in supervisory positions. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but they're participating as well. So we want to be sure to give them the opportunity to share as well. So we have Jeff and Suzanne who are here in the room with us. So either of y'all like to share?
I just know, I think for me, when I was a supervisor, one of the hardest things that I had to deal with was to not get my feelings hurt, to remember that it's not always about me, but I needed to look at that other person, my staff, and try to really see where they were coming from and not take things personal, and turning the situation around to what was best for me, but to what was best for the cafeteria, the department, and the people that I supervised.
Thank you, Suzanne.
I think for me, my first job as an assistant manager was right out of college. So I was young. I was 22 years old, and I was managing people that were 10 years, sometimes 15 years older than me. So it's difficult to have that conversation with them. Somebody to respect you, they see you as somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So it's difficult to manage that. But once you really learn how to talk to people and really form a bond with someone, it makes it a lot easier to be on the same page and have them respect you. I think a lot of people go into a situation of they should respect me because I'm your boss. You have to respect me. Well, we're all people, and I think that especially if you're younger and you're managing older people, you have to do work to gain that respect from people. You can't just go in and expect because you're their boss that they're going to respect you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. That is so true. Respect has to be earned. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do, what your position is. Respect has to be earned. And how do we earn respect? We earn respect by showing respect, by demonstrating respect. So that is so true. Anybody else? Can you guys just share on chat or unmute and just share how long you've been directors or managers? Because they're both directors and managers in the group. Okay. Get an idea of the kind of experience that we have in this group today.
This is April with Priority, and I've been a manager for 2 years.
Okay. You're a baby.
Yes, ma'am.
Manager.
Craig says 6 years.
6 years? Okay.
Lisa Mays, director for 6 years. Jennifer Green, 22 years.
Whoa, Jennifer Green, 22 years.
Shirley Oliver, 4 years as a director.
Shirley, you were a manager for many years as well, so you have quite a bit more experience.
Then 6 years.
Yes.
What did Calvin say?
Calvin hasn't answered yet.
Calvin, Jennifer wants to know if you have 100 years of experience. I want to meet you if you do.
Penelope, I think. Manager for 6 years and food service director for 2 months.
2 months. Ooh, okay.
That's Deborah Penelope. Joni is at Heiko. She's the new director there. She's a manager for 6 years and service director for 2 months. But I think she started kind of a little bit, taking over that role a little bit last year as well.
Okay.
But officially 2 months.
Congratulations. Okay, Craig never did let us know whether or not he has 100 years of experience, Jennifer, but
Calvin says 15.
15 years.
Close.
Was it Calvin that you're talking
Yeah.
about? Okay, Calvin. Calvin has 15 years, not quite 100. Probably feels like 100, Calvin, but not quite there yet. So there's a broad range of experience. And for those of you who are very seasoned, 22 years, 15 years, even the folk who have 2 months, but they have 6 years in another position. That's a lot of experience for someone who is relatively new. The person who's 2 months and just getting started and has not had that in-depth supervisory experience, you now know who some of the people are who've been around and have probably in all likelihood dealt with some of those more challenging behaviors or challenging employee behavior. So you know who those people are. You know who to pick up the phone and call and say, look, I got this one employee. I know we went through that little 2 hours with that lady and it was good while it was good, but now we're in a real spot. You know who those people are to pick up the phone and give a call, because you have to deal with it. You can't let those behaviors go. You have to deal with them if they're impacting other people. So our next slide asks, why is it so hard to have to deal with employees who have those challenging behaviors? So another 3 minutes. If you're a part of a group, talk about it in your group, but we're going to share those out via chat and unmuting and just sharing with the group as well. Why is it hard? Why is it hard to deal with people? Discipline is one of the most difficult things that we have to do in the work environment, or at least for me, the discipline was the most difficult. is. And it was in Corsicana, the beginning of East Texas.
Yeah.
We're unmuted?
Yep.
All right, guys, we are unmuted. Why is this hard? We've been having our own conversations here about why this is so hard. So we'd like to hear from you. Why is it hard to deal with these people who have some of these challenging behaviors?
You want to start off the ones online?
Sure.
So Calvin says each person has their own personality, and you have to know that when dealing with them one-on-one or as a group.
Awesome, Calvin. That's just kind of the discussion we're having here.
Craig says increased stress, time consuming, everyone reacts differently, no single right way to handle a situation. It's challenging to maintain composure dealing with negative employees.
Feels personal. Thank you, Craig.
And I think it is really hard to keep your emotions out of it, your own personal thoughts and views and beliefs when dealing with someone else that may be totally opposite of you. That's tough.
It is.
And not be
It's
upset.
very difficult. And so it's just easier sometimes to just let it go and let it go and let it go. Any other responses?
Hi, this is April with Priority.
Hi, April.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
How do you keep these situations from feeling personal?
You know, that's really, really difficult. I think when to depersonalize, we ask the question, what's behind this behavior? So we can focus on the behavior and the person, it feels less personal. We are humans. If it does feel personal, it becomes really important for us to have some ways to kind of deal with that and validate ourselves. I tend to be a storyteller, and this morning when I left, I said, no stories. When we don't have enough time, no stories. But I'm going to share a story about a child that I worked with. He was the most difficult child that I have ever worked with, and I worked for 10 years in a residential treatment center with emotionally disturbed juvenile delinquents. All of these kids have mental health issues, and in addition to that, they had broken the law. They had committed a felony, some type of felony offense. But he had extremely difficult behaviors. Nobody liked him. I promise you, no adult liked this kid, and I'd never met a kid that no adult liked. They wanted to get rid of him. I thought I was going to lose all of the 19 staff that I supervised because of this child and his behavior. And what he would do is find out where everybody's goats were, because we didn't hide our goats. We didn't tie our goats up. In other words, we would respond personally to some of the attacks that he made on people. And because of his skill set in doing that, he selected things that were very important to you and were very hurtful when he disrespected those things. So I thought, I've got to do something, because I was really pretty good by then. I had probably had 5 years of experience in working with that challenging population of kids when we got him, but his behaviors felt very personal to me. So I went home, and my husband had I think they're called peg boards or something, but anyway, so he could hang his tools out in the garage. And I got a piece of plywood, and I drew a big round head with ears and eyes and a nose and some eyeglasses on it, because this kid wore glasses. And I got, my grandmother had passed away, and I got her kitchen stuff. So there was an ice pick in her kitchen stuff. So I would come home from work, and I'd pick up that ice pick, and I'd stab that picture in the ground, and I had his name written on it. His name was John. And I stabbed John in the head or in the ear or just somewhere. And by the time I entered the house, the situation, that personal situation that I had endured with John that day was over. But even during the process of me stabbing that wood, by the time we moved, and my husband said, "Are you going to take that with you when we moved?" And I said, "Nah, I'm done with that. I actually like him now." But anyway, that was my release. But I kept asking, what's driving this kid's behavior? Because we didn't have adequate records on him. So for many years, I left and lost contact with kids and employees that I work with. And one day, this young man called to me. He was 23 years old by then. And he said, "Miss Ryan, I've been looking and looking and looking for you." And I said, "Who is this?" He said, "It's John." And I'm going to share his last name. His name is John Borgstead. And he said, "I have written a book and I'm making a movie and I want you to be in the movie." And I couldn't even speak, and because he called me at work. So anyway, I got reconnected with John, and he shares this story about the horrible, horrible abuse that he endured at the hands of his mother, primarily. His dad too, but mostly his mother, who did not want him. Both of his parents were professional people. So even when she broke his arm, and he told the neighbors, "My mother broke my arm," and of course they didn't believe him because the neighbors didn't like this kid either. But one neighbor called the police, and the police came out, and because his dad worked for the police department, nothing happened. So she would take him to different hospitals when she would, harm him to the point that he required medical attention. Well, when you got a kid who's endured that kind of behavior, basically from birth up to the age of 10, when we got him, the trust is not going to be there with anybody. If you can't trust the most important person in the world, how can you trust anybody else? So many, many years later, all of the behaviors that we saw from him made sense. And I wish that we had explored more in looking for this child's records, because as a child, he didn't have the ability to say, "I can't trust you. I couldn't even trust my mother because these are the things that she did to me." He had a seizure disorder when he came to us. And that was because his dad rammed his head into his police cruiser and left him with a seizure disorder. So when we think about those personal things that employees do, we ask the question, what's the function of this behavior? What are they trying to get through the use of this behavior? Or what is it that they're trying to avoid through the use of this behavior? Unfortunately, we hire people sometimes who don't like developing relationships with other people. And so they do all sorts of things to avoid having to interact with other people. If you put them in a position where they just work by themselves in isolation, they do just fine. But you put them with other people, and they may engage in some of those behaviors that we talked about earlier with people that they work with. They not only antagonize you as a supervisor, but they antagonize each other. And so then what do you do about that situation where you have employees going at each other? What we're talking about this morning is developing a skill set to be able to work with these people who come to us with all these different needs. I think it's been said several times, each person is different. Each personality is different. And that's okay. We want people to be different. We don't want cookie cutter employees. But what we do want is to think about, why do we have this behavior occurring in the work environment? When I work with classroom teachers, or when I work with parents especially, parents would say, "I never saw this behavior at home. I don't know where my kid learned to curse. Nobody in our household curses. We're devout Christians." And of course, teachers always think, right. But the reality is that you have employees who engage in behaviors at work, and they don't engage in those difficult behaviors anywhere else. It's just at work. And so asking that question to depersonalize the experiences that you're having with them. What are they trying to get from this behavior? Is it that they don't feel empowered? Do they feel threatened by me? And if so, what things am I doing that causes people that work for me to feel intimidated? So just kind of focusing on the behavior versus the person. We take away the person, and that helps it to feel less personal. Bottom line is we are human, and we have to do things when it does feel personal that makes us feel better about it until we can get it all worked out. Any other comments about that? Why it's so hard? You know, there are people in work environments that have been there 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. You will leave and go somewhere else to make more money, and they will still be there engaging in those same challenging behaviors because they've never been addressed. And eventually they just become a part of that's who that person is. And that's not okay for people to say, well, they do that. They bully people around and talk about people. That's just who they are. That's not okay. That's not okay. So we want to deal with it. So we're going to look at prevention. How do we prevent from the very beginning some of those behaviors from occurring in the work environment? I think it's really important that when people come to work for you, they know what your behavioral expectations are for employees. We don't have to, in school we call them rules. We all had rules when we were in school. In work environments, we simply call those expectations. And as administrators and supervisors, you have expectations for the people who work for you. And it's important that people know what your expectations are, and they're not left to their own judgment or their own ideas about what you want from them. So if you want a work environment that's calm, where people feel nurtured and they work together and they're concerned about getting the job done, and so forth. You have to set that expectation up front, and you have to continually do it when you have your team meetings or staff meetings to review the expectations for your particular work environment, because they may be very different from what an employee experienced in a different environment. So just thinking about what you expect and having some way of communicating that to the people in your environment. It's not uncommon to go into a workplace and there's a mission statement or a goal statement that encompasses all of those expectations that you have. So we can't assume that people know how we want them to behave in the workplace. Excuse me, we want to set that up and be clear in an ongoing manner with the people that we work for, so that hopefully we can prevent some of the problems that we looked at. We'll talk about how you do some of those things at the very end. Do we need to take a break? Please let us know via chat if you want to take a 5-minute break or if you want to just keep going.
Calvin said, please.
Okay. Anybody else?
Craig said he's fine.
Okay, we heard from Calvin. Calvin would like to have a break. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll begin promptly at the end of that 5 minutes. Welcome back from our brief break there, guys. And we're going to keep moving. So we talked about prevention. And let's see what's after prevention. All righty. One of my favorite skills, being a good listener. You know, we've kind of talked about people having different personalities. They're all different. There's a function for that behavior. There's a reason that that person is a whiner. Maybe they've been a whiner all their life because that need, whatever it is that they have, has not been met at any point or very many points during their life. So being a good listener is a way to find out sometimes what the function of that behavior is, why that person comes to you with those behaviors. Now, it's really difficult to call a person into the office and say, you know, they've been insubordinate. They haven't done anything you've asked them to do, and you've asked them to do 5 different things. They haven't done any of them. It's hard to call them in and say, you know what? You're not following instructions or directions. Let's just sit down and talk. Tell me about yourself. That relationship building and learning about your different employees has to be an ongoing process. And it has to be a natural process. So it's not something we can do just one time to call a person in and ask about how their life is going. But that's the way we find out about those behaviors sometimes and why individuals engage in those behaviors. Because as we develop that relationship and we get to know people, we start to learn things about them. And so sometimes those behaviors make sense, like John Borgstead. John has written a very powerful book, and I have a copy of it. And then there's also a movie, and I'm actually in the movie. But the title of his movie is I Love You, Mom. Please Don't Break My Heart. It's very, very powerful, and it's written from the perspective of a 10-year-old who engaged in those behaviors. And while I started to develop a relationship with John just before I left, I was really heartbroken when we reconnected, you know, 20 years later or so, and found out that those things had happened. And I said, why didn't you share those? And he said, I couldn't because I know you would turn my mom in. And I still loved my mom despite the fact that she had done all of those things to me. So, you know, taking the opportunity to get to know your employees individually, one-on-one. And I know that you guys hit the floor running in the morning and it doesn't stop until the end of the day for you. But it really, really is important to take that 2 minutes or that 3 minutes and just stop by a particular employee and say, you know, hey, notice you worked really, really hard today. Of course, we all did, but how's it going with you? And begin to learn that information, because as people become more comfortable, as their relationship starts to develop, they begin to share things with you, share information with you that perhaps allows us to share, to have insight on why they behave in the ways that they do. That know-it-all, connecting with the know-it-all is a great way, where they know it all in front of their coworkers and in front of you. When we start to connect with that know-it-all and say, you know what, you have some really great ideas sometimes. Maybe you and I can take 5 minutes and sit down at the end of the workday and you can just share some of those with me, because I value some of the ideas that you share. That's very empowering, and it's giving that know-it-all the power to feel validated to say, you know, well, I know a lot, and they recognize that I know a lot, whether they do or not, but it validates that individual. And so you start to see less of that know-it-all behavior in front of everybody else. I once did a workshop, and there was a person who kind of contradicted everything that I said in the workshop. And at lunchtime, before lunch, I said, do you have lunch plans? And he said, no, I was just going to go and grab me something. And I said, me too. So can we bring it back here? Because you have some ideas that I really hadn't thought about that you've been sharing with the group. And I tell you, for the rest of the day, that behavior went away. Other people in the room were rolling their eyes when he'd say something like, please make him shut up. But no problems the rest of the day, just by, sitting with that person for about 20 minutes and allowing him to talk and say, I never thought about it that way. And how do you do this or whatever? Quiet the rest of the day. So as we get to know people and who they are through developing that relationship, being a really good listener, because as a listener, sometimes we get the real meanings behind some of that behavior. So being a listener, and that's one of those skills that we all learned a long time ago, and it's real difficult sometimes to sit and listen, especially when we disagree with what the person is saying, or when we disagree with the behavior that they've been demonstrating in the work environment. But being a good listener is the first step to developing the kind of relationship with an employee where we can become a problem solver, where we can begin to understand that personality and why those behaviors are part of that particular personality. So that's an aspect of thinking about prevention. It's just listening to people individually as and developing a relationship to get to know them. Addressing the behavior, the hard part. Addressing unacceptable behavior is important, and we need to clearly address that behavior. So if you have an individual who is, let's see what's on our list, a more serious behavior. A whiner, a complainer is serious to me, but for most people that probably would not be at the top of their list. So let's select one that's a little more serious from our list here. How about a person who challenges your authority? The kind of person who comes with the attitude of who died and made you God? Kind of challenging authority. So overt challenges to your authority in front of other people that you supervise and so on. That's pretty serious behavior. And so we really want to address that behavior. In terms of addressing behavior, it's really important to identify very specific times that behavior occurred and to address that behavior in measurable and observable terms. That is, what does that behavior look like? What does it look like when that person challenged your authority? What did it look like when they were hostile? So we talk about voice tone, we talk about voice level, we describe the words, we give them the words that they actually say it. So to just say, you were really hostile today and you challenged my authority, and that's not okay. That's not enough. We want to be as specific as possible in describing those behaviors. Now, why is that important? It's important because there may be next steps that you have to take later on. And so you want to have information that's documented. You want to be sure that the employee has a clear understanding of what hostile behavior looked like on that particular day, what it sounded like, what challenging your authority looked like, and what that behavior sounded like on that particular day. So we give the kind of feedback so that people know what they need to change. So if I just say that hostility, it can't be tolerated in the workplace. That didn't give them any definition of what hostility is. So I want to be sure that you're using and describing behavior in measurable and observable terms. If I said to anybody else, they raised their voice level, they used words that were not appropriate for the workplace, i.e. there are some stupid people here. If I can describe those things to anybody else, I want them to say, gee, they were hostile to you, without me saying that this is a hostile person. So be sure that when you're talking with the person about that behavior, when you're addressing that behavior, that you identify why that behavior is not appropriate for the workplace, in addition to describing what that behavior looks like and what that sounded like. We don't want to use vague terms that can have lots of different meanings. And I think the example that's in your PowerPoint is saying you were rude today. Well, what did they do that was rude? Because that person may not view their behavior as rude behavior. It's just who I am. Sarcasm is the same thing. There are people who are very sarcastic, and that can be hurtful to others. And they say, well, you know, that's just who I am. Well, you know, making comments that make others feel bad is maybe who you are, but it's not appropriate for the workplace. So let the employee know what your expected behaviors are instead of the behaviors that they're engaging in. And that's no easy task to do that, but it's important that you let the person know what they said or what they did, why it's not appropriate for the work environment, and what you want them to say or do instead in that situation. Next is one that's really critically important, and I have to admit that there were a lot of times I didn't do this and I wish I had, and that's documentation. Even if it's an informal conference, you just bring them in and say, can we talk about a behavior that I observed yesterday that is not okay. It's just not okay here in the workplace. You know, we try to create an environment where everybody is comfortable and everybody feels valued. And on yesterday, you said whatever it was that they said and rolled your eyes when, you know, I asked you to do this, or when the manager asked you to do this, or whatever. And that's not okay in our work environment. What we'd like for you to do is to follow through with what's being asked of you, because that makes the job easier for you and everybody else involved. And is there anything that I can do to help you to be able to do that? And of course, most of the time they say, no, you know, I was just having a bad day, blah, blah, blah. We say, okay, I understand. We all have bad days. But I need for you to know that I'm going to take some notes on this. I'm just going to document that we had this conversation, and it'll just go in a file in my desk and hopefully never to be revisited again. Whether you ever revisit it or not, it's important to document that you had that conversation with that individual. Nothing formal, just notes for yourself. But it can become a part of the documentation if you need documentation later on down the road. So addressing the behavior and then documenting that you address the behavior is really important, especially if it's a more serious behavior that's occurred more than once, or it's occurring frequently in the work environment. A lot of times we call people in and we talk to them about their behavior and we never follow up. Sometimes they don't change their behavior. You know, they're still the same person, engaging in the same behavior, making people feel uncomfortable, decreasing the morale. But we talk to them and we even document it, but we never follow up. It's really important if you have a conversation with an employee to call that employee in 2 weeks or in a month and just have a conversation with them. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about blah, 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 whatever it is that you discuss with them. And I want you to know that I have not noticed that behavior anymore. And I appreciate that, because you're a valued member of our team here. You know, I enjoy working with you. Anything you need, please let me know. But I just wanted to follow up with you and let you know that I've noticed a change in that behavior. And if the behavior has not changed, that follow-up is equally important to say, we had a conversation, it was just informal. You know, ask you to think about some other ways of addressing your frustration with your coworkers. I'm still seeing the hostile behavior, i.e. on last week you did whatever. Just this morning you said blah, blah, blah. So what can I do to help you change that behavior? Because it's not working for you or any of us here. So what can I do? And then allow them an opportunity to give you feedback. And if we're doing a follow-up because the behavior has not changed, we need to let that employee know that now we're going to move into formal documentation, because we've already had a conversation with them once. So people need to know that. We don't want to just wait until it has gotten so bad and then we call them in and say, look, we're going to put you on disciplinary steps. I've talked to HR. That's not fair to the employee. But if we've had a conversation, allowed them an opportunity, we've offered to assist them in behavioral change, because sometimes I've heard people say, I don't know how to do that differently. I just don't know how. And if people are honest enough to tell you that they don't know how to do it as a supervisor or someone in a supervisory position, we have a responsibility to say, well, let me give you some ideas, or let me outline some steps, and then see what you think about it. So we'll get back together to do that. So there are people who lose control and they're really angry. That's that angry person that comes into the work environment. So they have poor anger management skills. So maybe finding an anger management class, looking for some anger management tips for them, and then documenting that we provided that to the employee becomes really important as part of that follow-up when the behavior doesn't change. So any thoughts or comments about that? How comfortable are most of you with having those conversations about behavior, documenting, and then engaging in follow-up with the person? Any comments or thoughts you have about that? Send them to us via chat. Okay, we have no chats over there, so your thoughts are in your head, which is good. Not ready to share them, but they're in your head. That's okay. A part of the process when we're meeting with employees, especially when you follow up and there has not been a behavioral change, the kind of change that we're looking for. Another important aspect of that process, or developing those skills or that skill set, is to be able to identify the consequences for that employee if the behavior does not change. You know, there are consequences for all behavior. So in that follow-up, when the behavior changes and you acknowledge that behavioral change, the consequence of that is that behavioral change is positive feedback. You're giving them positive feedback. And there may be improved relationships, so we point that out. I noticed that, you know, you and the small team that you work with are laughing and talking and getting along, but that's a consequence of that behavioral change. If the behavior, however, does not change, it's important that people know what the consequences are if they continue in those patterns of behavior. So we can talk with them in that follow-up meeting about what the possibilities are if they choose not to change, because we can't make anybody change, it's a choice. So if they choose not to change, what are the consequences? The consequences the consequences differ based on your process, your disciplinary process. So you want to know what that is. You want to check in with your HR person, be sure that you know what the consequences should be, especially if you work for a district that uses progressive discipline. So to say to a person, you know, if this doesn't change, you probably will not be working here. And the reality is that's not a fireable behavior that they're engaging in, and they're not going to be fired because of that behavior. Even if it continues, we're setting ourselves up in that situation so that people feel like, well, we don't know what we're talking about. And for a hostile or an insubordinate employee, that's very empowering, and we don't want them to have power in that way. So you want to be sure that you know what the potential consequences could be for that person. So talking with your HR department, talking with you know, whoever the powers that be about what you can do with an employee who refuses to change their behavior, because it's not always a fireable behavior that they're engaging in. We may not be able to let them go. So we certainly don't want to jump to that. We can also talk about personal consequences that the individual might experience. So if you have someone who's constantly whining and complaining, and other employees coming to you saying, I don't really want to be around them. I'm tired of hearing them complain about everything. We just need to get the job done. Can you transfer them somewhere else? That make it hard for me or hard for us. And you have a conversation with that person about it, but it doesn't change, then what are the potential consequences if that behavior continues? You know, what is it that realistically you might be able to do? So it's important to point that out to the individual, because they're responsible for choosing to change their behavior if they choose. And if not, they choose not to change, then what's the consequence of that? In terms of relationships with other employees, in terms of the work environment and their impact on the work environment. So just thinking through about those consequences. And if you can take the personal feelings out of that, it's even better, because we always want to jump to say, and I've been guilty of this may not be the place for you. You might want to think about working somewhere else for someone else, with a different population or whatever. And that's not always appropriate either. So if the person is willing to change, you know, maybe a consequence is that we list some type of work plan for them. The result of that is we're going to develop a work plan and present that work plan to you. So whatever it is, you just want to be sure that they know what the potential consequences are if they continue to engage in those particular behaviors.
We get to have one comment.
Okay, what's the comment?
Right before you start talking. It says it's never an easy conversation, but usually once you address the problem, the situation does get better.
Yeah, people will choose to change. Sometimes the reality is, and that's a great point. Who sent that in?
Craig.
Craig. Thank you, Craig. You should be doing this session, Craig. The reality is that sometimes people don't really realize how their behavior impacts others. And that's just who they are. You know, whiners typically whine everywhere. Complainers typically complain everywhere. I have people at church, my church, who are complaining. How do you complain about God? But that's just who they are. And nobody ever says, to them personally, I get so tired of her complaining. Why does she even come? And you know, those are people that are involved in everything. This particular lady is involved in everything in the church. Every activity, she's involved in it. And in every activity, people say, I wish you'd just stay at home. Oh, I get so tired of hearing her complain, but nobody ever addresses it. That's because we're having supervisors in the church. But if we really loved her and cared about it, we would point that out to her. You know, there are a lot of situations that you have strong feelings about, and, you know, you kind of tend to voice those, and they make other people feel bad when you do that or whatever. You know, find some way to do that. But usually if we point it out, people will change their behavior, especially if it's a supervisor that's involved with them and you have a relationship with the person. You point it out, you know, a lot of times it does go away. So thank you again for sharing that, Craig. I think we forget that sometimes. So we're going to follow up with them. We're going to address the consequences of that behavior. And then depending on what the behavior is, we want to be particularly aware of any legal issues that might result from meeting with that individual. Even if it is just a checking in with you meeting, kind of it's informal, we still want to be aware of legal issues. And of course, your HR can provide that information to you as well. So there are legal risks that can be involved with, people can legally get an attorney and sue for anything they choose. Doesn't have to make sense, but they can do it. So you just want to be aware that sometimes calling people in to address behaviors, the behaviors that we consider challenging behavior, may have some legal risk involved. And so I've just kind of listed the protected categories of individuals, and we may or may not know whether or not, you know, a person has a disability, because not all disabilities are visible. There are some hidden disabilities, including those surrounding mental health issues and so on. So you just want to be sure. And if you're documenting, even for an informal meeting, you want to contact your HR person or your direct supervisor or whatever, and just say, well, I had an informal meeting with so-and-so regarding some behaviors that they're displaying. I wrote some notes for myself and filed them away. I just want to let you know, because if they hightail it, as my grandma used to say, to HR the next day and say, look, this person called me in and they talked about this particular behavior because I'm Black. And I tell you that everybody who's white does the same thing and nothing is ever said about it. Well, HR has to address that, whether it's true or not. And most of the time it's not going to be true. So just be aware and, you know, look at this slide at some point in time, especially if you think about calling someone in for a formal or an informal disciplinary conference with them. Not to say that you don't want to do it simply because there may be some legal risk. But the important thing is that you want to keep all disciplinary conversations focused on the behavior and not the person. So as a behaviorist, I talk a lot about behavior, objectifying behavior, talking about what it looked like, talking about what it sounds like, talking about when it occurred, how many times it occurred, because those are the things that will protect you if that's all you focused on, rather than the individual person. So using due care. Just when it reaches the point that it truly does become a disciplinary issue that has to be documented and so on. Be consistent. You want to address that disruptive behavior with all employees, even your favorite employee. And it's only been occurring with them for a week. Maybe there's something going on with them because this is not typically who they are. But remember that employee that has that challenging or difficult behavior that's been going on for 2 months and we finally addressed it. They're watching that person who's now engaging in very similar behavior. And there may be something going on with that employee. So we have to be fair and create a work environment where individuals feel that we're a fair person. Fairness and equity are critical to the work environment. So being a person who demonstrates that fairness to the person that we love versus the person that we wish would just go and get a job at ABC school district and get up out of here is equally important. We treat them both the same in terms of how we address behavior. So employers look to see what you do rather than what you say. So we just have to remember they're watching us. They're watching us with the good and they're watching us with the bad. A part of creating that positive relationship with individuals and creating a place where people feel empowered, where they feel in control, where they feel that they have a voice in how work is done, is looking at whether or not we have a positive work environment. Where have we taken the time to evaluate or to assess? How does it feel to work in this place? So I listed just a few things that we can do to create that positive work environment for our employees. Acknowledging the positive actions or behaviors of employees is really important. We go through our day-to-day work, getting the job done because that's what's expected. But when we take the time to acknowledge people for the hard work that they put in, It goes a long way. It really goes a long way when we acknowledge the positive aspects of the work environment. We want to celebrate successes in the work environment. I did a session for food service employees over the summer, back in July. And there were people who talked about ways that they celebrate each other, that they celebrate their customers. And there was one group of food service workers who said that they write. It started with one employee who would write positive notes on the sneeze guard for students, but what they realized later was that there were adults who enjoyed and looked forward to seeing those. As a matter of fact, they said this lady was out one day and nobody wrote a positive note, and the principal came through and said, "Where's our positive acknowledgement for the day? Where are our incentives? Where's our motivation for today?" So the positives go a long way, especially when we have an environment where morale is poor because you've got that one person or people are calling in sick or whatever. And then celebrating successes. You know, if you make a whole week and everybody came to work, that's a reason to celebrate. Go and buy a jar of sour pickles and everybody have a sour pickle to celebrate a good week. Stick a peppermint stick in it. Just little things that acknowledge and make the work environment a more positive place to come to every day. Engage in team building activities when you have time. That's time consuming, but taking a couple of minutes when you have a meeting to do something that's fun, to allow people to get to know each other on a more personal level, to build those relationships. A 3-minute activity can be so much fun. Writing positive notes to employees. And if you have non-English speaking employees, find somebody to write the note for you. It's important that we validate each other for being the human beings that we are. We need to be acknowledged. Smile even when you don't feel like it, even when you don't want to smile. Smile anyway. A smile goes a long way. Verbally support teamwork because you have a team. All of your staff function as a team. So you want to validate that teamwork to build that camaraderie among your employees. And oftentimes that employee that you have that has that difficult and challenging behavior will begin to change when they find themselves in an environment where everyone is validated equally and supported equally. So any comments? All right, let's talk about a scenario. We have, according to my watch, about 7 minutes. So I'm going to give you a scenario unless somebody has one. So first of all, does anyone have a situation that you would like to put out for all of us to kind of talk about and look at and do a little problem solving with? Either unmute and share it with us or send it to us in chat.
Craig at Mahia said, asking an employee to help at another school, but they refused and threatened to quit.
Ooh, that's a good one, Craig. I heard lots of people talk about that during the summer, how difficult it is to be asked to go to another campus. All right, so Craig has put that out, and let's do a little problem solving with that. So everyone will need to participate in our problem solving. So what do you do? Because sometimes you have to ask employees to go to other campuses to fill in, and it may be for more than one day. That's just the reality and the nature of the work. So what do you do? What are some positives that you can do with that employee who doesn't want to go, refuses to go, and threatens to quit if you make them go? And what category would we put that in? I would put it in insubordination. So where would some of the others of you put it? All right, let's take about 3 minutes and do a little problem solving. And when you're ready, unmute or send us some strategies for addressing that employee on chat. 3 minutes. That's better than the one I had, Craig.
And it comes up a lot.
I know, but people talked about it a lot during the summer.
I don't think those people.
I know, their situation was to have subs ready to go, just like teachers. It's like, but you know, the reality is. What are some solutions?
So I have one on here from Calvin. It says, need to make sure you start your year off with your expectations about the possibility of having to move people around from time to time if needed. When the problem occurs, remind them and thank them for helping out like the others do. If you still have issues, then use my director card, remind them we all have to help out when needed.
Okay.
And
Awesome.
then April said, speak to them about the importance of team, offer something in exchange for them going, building them up also goes a long way.
Way to go, April. Offer them something in exchange. Anybody else? Jennifer asked me what I would do, so I'm gonna throw in my 1 cent worth. It doesn't even work 2 cents, but I'm gonna throw in my 1 cent worth. Change is difficult, And when we have to go and do something that we're not accustomed to doing, it does put you out of your comfort zone. But validating setting up the expectation, I think Calvin said that early on, that very early on, people know that there's a possibility that this may happen. And so the expectation is we're going to cover that other campus just as we would expect them to cover if somebody here were at. So setting up that expectation up front. Secondly, would be validating the individual who has to do it, whether they choose to do it or not. Now, if a person says, I'm not going to do it because that was the original thing, I'm going to quit, we can't keep anybody from quitting, but we can remind them that what the expectation is. And then we leave that decision to them. And if they choose to quit, they quit. But the expectation is that you go and you work on the other campus. If an individual chooses to go and work on the other campus, I do think that it's important to acknowledge that, and that we acknowledge that in some way other than just saying thank you. Thank you goes a long way, but giving that person a card, a gift certificate, and Walmart loves school people. HEB loves school people. They love you guys. It doesn't matter what capacity you are in the school. Food service to being the superintendent, they love school people. So go to Walmart, go to HEB and say, look, I have an awesome staff of people. And if you guys are willing to donate $5 gift cards or gift certificates to us, I would so appreciate that. Florists are wonderful. I worked with the campus one year and their morale was really low. And so one of the things that we talked about was sending everyone a flower arrangement on their birthday, regardless of when it was. And they went to local florists and said, if you do this, we're going to advertise you on our campus website. Florist said, I'd be more than happy to do that. And every employee on their campus got a bouquet of flowers, from the custodian all the way up to the principal and the nurse on that. Everybody got a bouquet delivered to them, whether it was at their home or to the campus on their birthday. So people will give you stuff. So finding stuff to give people. So when you say thank you, you're also acknowledging them in a way with something tangible. So that's what I would do. I'm a hustler. So Master Foods, which is M&M Mars, for those of you that live in the area, will donate cases of Snickers and Skittles, and they make Snickers, Skittles. They make 3 products here in Waco, but they will give you cases of them, and all you have to do is send in a request on your school letterhead. So tying a Snicker to a card that says, no snickering, you're an awesome person, and giving that to them will go a long way. So that's what I would do. Any other?
I have one more. So this is an area that should be addressed before hiring, like Calvin said. Speak to them about why they would not be willing and document the results.
Okay. Sometimes people are not willing because it's a change, and change is difficult, even if it's a small change. I don't know those people on that campus. I don't know those kids on that campus. I don't know how they treat people on that campus. So, even having an opportunity to walk that employee, to meet that employee there, so that before they ever have to go there, your folk know folk on the other campus, could be helpful. It takes away some of the uncertainty about who those people are and what will happen there.
Well, even to go along with that, you could even have situations where you switch employees every so often, just for a day, so they can get acquainted with the other staff.
Right.
Work together. So when it does come time for them to fill in another campus, they do know the staff already and kind of know the expectations.
Right. Because change is difficult. All right, guys, we are out of time. So can they see me now? Yeah. Can you see me now? How's that? All right, that's great. I want to take the opportunity to thank you. I never take for granted the opportunity to work with educators. And you guys are all educators as well. You're all in the business of educating children. You provide that in a different way than classroom teachers, but it's still about educating children and helping kids to maximize from the educational environment that they're in. So I never take that lightly when I have an opportunity to work with individuals in a school district. So again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. I know that there was a question early on about employee to employee conflict. What I can do is send Suzanne a 5-step approach that I use and I share with people all the time about resolving conflict. So you can use it with an employee, or you can in your training say, this is what we're going to do when you guys have problems with each other. I just need to know when it's going to happen. And it's a basic 5-step approach for resolving issues. And I can certainly send that to Suzanne. So if you're interested in that, please let Suzanne know. So again, thank you. And you guys have a wonderful school year. And I hope you use butter with kids. I'm a big fan of butter and bread.